Well, I'm not sure how much technical stuff I'm going to talk about. I was given the title of worrying about the open mic incident, and that prompted more think. Well, we'll answer the questions, whatever you ask, but it prompted reflections in my part back to my arms control era, and so that's what I want to talk a little bit about. Of course, I don't remember the exact quote, but the gist of it was that President Obama told President Medvedev that if he would just give him a little space, he'd have more flexibility after November in some subsequent negotiations, of course, assuming that he would still be president after November, and neglecting, of course, the lame duck session if he isn't. Well, I think it's important in looking at that and addressing, the excuses that have been made by the media and others for how this just reflects the reality that you can't get anything done during the silly season of presidential politics. You need to remember the context for this. And you only have to go back less than a month to discussions that he was having with Medvedev, when he was pressing an agenda of cooperation in implementing European defenses, and or else there would be effective countermeasures on the part of Russia, including a revival of what seemed to me sort of like the INF era of the late 1970s and 1980s, when then the Soviet Union deployed medium-range missiles to threaten our European allies, NATO overall. And this is all in the context now of tactical nuclear missiles that he's talking about. And I remind you that Russia retains thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, 10 times as many as we, since we unilaterally built ours down along the way and didn't include them at all in the so-called New START treaty. And it's only one of the unhelpful remnants of the New START treaty, which in fact required a build-down in U.S. nuclear forces while authorizing a build-up of Russian nuclear forces. More recent data from Mr. Obama's travels around the world have suggested that he's prepared to go even lower, whatever the Russians might have in mind, even suggestions of going all the way down to very low levels in concert with his agenda of zero nuclear weapons, and regrettably the agenda of some others of our erstwhile friends who have talked about that goal. And of course doing this while reneging in his administration on the promises that he made to the United States Senate during the New START ratification hearings and so on. Now these recent suggestions to share data, which prompted a response from the House and I think the Senate as well, and I think it was a welcome Hill response. Whatever was really intended by Brad Roberts' comments and discussions up here on the Hill and elsewhere. And I personally agree, especially with any kind of cooperation that and data sharing that would lead to limits on missile defenses, particularly the Aegis system. I think there's a serious lack of trust that is justified by our friends here on the Hill. And while I'm not particularly concerned about what was the focus of that, which was the burnout velocity of the SM-3, which in my judgment the Russians probably know from watching some 20 or so of our tests, and whether or not we've shared it with them before. But I am concerned about executive agreements on other matters that could end up limiting our defenses, and we've had experience with this. I would remind you during the Clinton years, a side agreement that was made at the United Nations that limited our theater missile defense vertical burnout velocities to 3 kilometers per second. And I have little doubt but what that limitation, which wasn't explicit on the Navy system and on the Aegis system, ended up restraining the development of that system. So these executive agreements and things on the side, and while people would say, well, nobody's planning to do anything like that in the near term, they end up binding the hands of our technical people. And as a matter of fact, the entire Aegis system is witness to this, because in the early days of the development of the air defense systems for our naval forces, as I'm sure Admiral Lyons will remember, the radar on those ships were precluded from looking up because of the ABM treaty and the concern that it might be able to intercept a ballistic missile. And of course, you couldn't have sea-based missile defenses if they could protect the United States. And I can talk a little bit about that era and what went on and how we got the Navy program started on my watch, and how my advice to Admiral Kelso was to insist that it stay as a theater missile defense program, because if he breached in any way away from that toward defending against ICBMs, which is inherently possible, and we knew it was inherently possible at the beginning, then the folks in this town who opposed missile defenses would have killed the program outright. Such is the politics of what we're dealing with, and the reality of how those politics can bind the hands of the technical people. Let's see. For 5 years, Frank's already mentioned it, I spent in Geneva talking with the Soviets and in Moscow and other places along the way and with our allies. So I have a certain perspective on this, and it probably made Frank nervous at times because he was watching from back here and not sure whether he trusted me or not, I guess. Because our agenda, by agreed instructions, in fact, in the interagency process, was to pursue an agenda of cooperation with the Soviet Union instead of confrontation as the way ahead. This is what Reagan wanted to do. Reagan was, in fact, willing to share more of our technology than I certainly was, or most of my colleagues were, including Frank. And we managed to waltz our way through all of that without compromising anything. But we had a boss during that time, and I'm speaking of Reagan now personally, and not just the people around him. In fact, some of the people closely around him were not all that loyal, if you know the inside story of what went on. But Reagan could be trusted on these issues because he knew what he was about. He understood the benefits of and demanded truly effective arms control agreements in the context of building up and modernizing our strategic forces, which had atrophied. And we had programs in place, you may not remember, since most of you are too young, that we went for 18 months, I believe it was, or something like that, with the press beating up on us because we weren't negotiating with the Soviets. And what we were doing, of course, was restarting terminated production lines, modernizing our strategic forces and all the rest of it so that Reagan could negotiate from strength. He knew something about negotiations. And he demonstrated at Reykjavik that he would say no if he wasn't getting things that he really wanted to pursue. And we all knew this, all of us that worked for him, that he truly wanted effective missile defenses. And while he was willing to talk about them, he was not willing to give up anything that would be, in his opinion, effective. And it wasn't just because of his movies with Bonzo the Clown and that sort of thing. He'd done more homework than all of that, as many people now realize when they read the speeches he wrote in his own hand while he was working with the GE. And I can tell you he wrote his own speeches for Gorbachev as well. And overruled the State Department on more than one occasion in terms of what he had to say. But during that period, and when he walked out of Reykjavik, he was pursuing an agenda in missile defenses that went considerably further than anything we're doing now. Space was at the heart of what we were doing, space defenses, and largely for reasons that I assume you understand, that because it's closest, it's the way you get closest to the missile that is threatening you, and you can shoot it down in its boost phase before it can deploy countermeasures and that sort of thing. And so that was the top priority with him. And at Reykjavik, Gorbachev wanted to restrain everything to the laboratory. No experiments or testing outside the laboratory. And even though Gorbachev had agreed to a whole bunch of things that Reagan really wanted at Reykjavik, including the 50% reductions that we ultimately embodied in a treaty and eliminating INF forces. And we put those things in our pocket, but Reagan walked out without giving Gorbachev any satisfaction. So we in Geneva and in the community as a whole understood that we had a boss who was willing to talk, but he was going to protect our national interests. That's a very important thing to have if you're going to deal with people who wish us ill. And the Russians make it clear that they, whether we view them as an enemy or not, they view us as their principal adversary. So we need to be clear about these matters. Reagan turned detente policies on their head, demanding verifiable agreements clearly in our national interests while modernizing and building up our forces and pursuing a robust SDI program. Obama seems more inclined to policies of appeasement and has since the beginning of his administration, while pursuing unverifiable agreements and cutting our atrophying defenses. I checked with Admiral Lyons to make sure that the rumor I picked up from somewhere was accurate, that we're on the path to the number of Navy ships at the lowest level since World War I, while we pivot to an air-land or air-sea strategy focused on Asia and the Western Pacific, our largest largest ocean operating areas. It doesn't really sound like a serious policy to me if it's not going to be backed up with real forces. Well, I hope for a very different strategy after November that's based on a peace through strength approach that Reagan pursued, whatever that may mean for flexibility with respect to Russia. Now, I'd be happy to take your questions and address technical issues that you want to talk about as well, but I because of the subject I was given,
Listen, that was my fault, Hank. Thank you. A terrific presentation, needless to say, of real value to what we're all about here. And I apologize for getting bollocksed on the other topic, but he is here and capable of addressing specifically the question that was almost put, or others. So floor is open. Claire?
Claire?
I would like to ask about the Korean missile launch and the fact that it failed apparently either at or just after the first stage, when previous launches went further and failed at the second or perhaps the third stage. What would that indicate in terms of why would they not be able to do what they had done before and replicate that? And what implications does that have for the Iranian cooperation and their joint venture program, if you will, on missile development?
Well, the devil's always in the details, Claire, and I don't know what those details are. As you say, they have tested before, and they claim they put a satellite in orbit, and I understand that some may dispute that, but it was, as you said, all the stages seemed to work up until the separation of the last. And so they had demonstrated a capability to stage 2009, I believe it was, or something like that. The first series of tests they did was a barrage of short and medium-range missiles in 1998. So this is not a new track that they're on. I would remind you that at least at NASA, we had a year, it seems like, of failures of rockets before we got one that really worked after we had instituted the moon program. And that was a new effort inside the United States. And you may or may not recall this history, but Sam Phillips, who was running things for Benny Schriever on the West Coast with the Atlas program and building our ultimately long-range ICBMs, was sent to NASA to manage that program, Lieutenant General who was Schriever's right-hand man, and getting things in order. So details matter, and the rigors of a sound system engineering team matter. In that case, Sam took the Boeing team that had pioneered Atlas and Minuteman out on the West Coast with him to NASA. So history tells you that even people who know what they're doing sometimes have difficulty with testing. Another thing from history that bears on this argument of they were only launching satellites is just to remember that Sputnik in 1957 put a satellite in orbit, but the same missile that put the satellite in the orbit became the first of the ICBMs of the Soviet Union. So this is a phony argument to say that, well, we're only, doing peaceful purposes. We tried the same thing, by the way. The NRO we can talk about today, the National Reconnaissance Office, when that was set up, it was a super secret program, and NASA was set up to do peaceful things in space, and NRO was doing quiet things, reconnaissance things, because Eisenhower in particular was concerned about avoiding another Pearl Harbor, and he wanted to look inside the Soviet Union, and you remember the Powers incident and shoot down and so on. So he was on a space agenda for reconnaissance purposes, and he didn't know when they started how they were going to deal with the overflight issues, overflying sovereign territory. When Sputnik happened, that settled that issue because Russia did it first and we could respond. But unfortunately, we left ourselves with tied hands that remain today a problem for building missile defenses in space, because space is all about peaceful purposes, you see. And so we originate some of these policies, have originated some of these policies that bite us now as well. That's my point.
Any other questions?
I don't know whether that deals with the technical details, because I don't know the specifics of what actually went wrong, but the engineering team is key. And as you say, the Iranians were there. I think we know that. And they're watching closely and, of course, they're cooperating. North Korea will sell to anybody with money. So, yes.
Yes, Travis.
We've seen over the past month or so the great success of the Iron Dome program in Israel. I was wondering if you could kind of speak to why that program has been so successful and what the U.S. could do to replicate some of those defenses to incorporate them into our programs.
Well, I'm not familiar with all the details. Some of the others in the room may be, but my understanding is that one of the aspects of the Iron Dome is that they choose what they shoot at. In other words, if a missile is coming at them and they recognize that it's going to land in territory that is not a problem, they let it go. They don't try to shoot at everything that comes. And that's an important factor because the cost exchange is against the defense, heavily against the defense in even that case. And of course, you're dealing with not nuclear weapons that are being launched toward Israel, but high explosives, conventional weapons. That game would change in a very difficult way if you were dealing with weapons of mass destruction being carried by the missiles. Dare I bring up another political subject, but during the Reagan years and the SDI years, this issue became a matter of major contention here on Capitol Hill. And some of the senators are still around, Carl Levin in particular, who were beating up on anybody wanting to do anything with missile defenses because of this adverse cost exchange business. And they wrote into the law of the land what was referred to then as the NHTSA criteria. Paul NHTSA, an eminent statesman, friend, and a colleague and one I admire, a policy guy who was a little too taken on occasions with technical details, but nevertheless, I really admire him, former Deputy Secretary of Defense as well. I mean, and basically he had advocated that before we deploy an effective defense, it had to be effective against countermeasures, and it also had to be cost-effective at the margin, meaning that one missile defense interceptor has to cost less than the attacking weapon. That's a daunting demand. None of the systems we have deployed today would meet that demand. The only system that came out of the SDI era that I believed would have met that demand was a program called Brilliant Pebbles, which was a proliferated, space-based interceptor program. It became politically incorrect in the Clinton era when Les Aspin took the stars out of Star Wars and has not been revived through subsequent administrations, either Clinton or even the more recent Bush administration, and it will be a challenge. I submit to you to revive it in what I hope will be a new team that goes back to some of the Reagan ways. That will be a political challenge for folks in this room to help meet, because the obstacles are quite large. It's a legacy of this idea that Galileo faced. You know, with the telescope, you're looking into God's domain, and you don't want to have weapons in space. You want to have peaceful things in space only. Never mind that the nuclear weapons come through space to rain down on you. So, but that's a real challenge, political challenge. Ken?
Hank, thanks for the presentation. I wonder if you can give us a kind of more general appreciation or evaluation of the effectiveness of the Aegis system. If we deployed Aegis ships off of our coasts, for example,
Yeah.
Would they be able to intercept the Scud in the bucket? In other words, a Scud missile or a lower technology missile launched from a commercial freighter off of our coast 100 or 150 miles going up into an EMP trajectory. Would that give us an effective defense?
How's that for a slow ball? Thanks, Ken. You may know, some of you may know that. I consider that one of the real, the things I'm most proud of in my watch, because I persuaded the Navy to begin the Aegis program. And I think it's the most effective defense that we have today, frankly. And it has been tested. The SM-3 Block 1A, which is deployed now on some 22 ships around the world, both in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, and in the, I don't know where, in the Arabian Peninsula area, is carrying the Block 1A interceptor. It was tested last April, almost a year ago, against a intermediate range missile, some 3,700 kilometer range missile. And it shot it down. And it was a target that was, so I am told, more complex than any that has been tested against with the ground-based interceptors in Alaska that are dedicated to the ICBM mission. So as Admiral J.D. Williams, I assume you know, Lace, and I have been advocating for, a decade, more than a decade. The Aegis system is inherently capable of shooting down ICBMs if you provide the sensor information, the queuing information to it, and that's all that was done in the instance last April. We have ships at sea that have been tested now against missiles in their ascent phase, not boost phase, after the rockets have ceased to burn, and the warheads are coasting, perhaps as early enough to get ahead of the decoy release, but still in the ascent phase. We've successfully tested them against. I don't think we've gotten to the medium range stage, but I think the intermediate range stage of rockets going up, and that was several years ago. And so those ships that are operating near our coasts can intercept Scuds or even longer range missiles if they're launched off of ships, near the coast. The one exception remaining is the Gulf of Mexico, where Aegis doesn't generally operate. And there is a place to be worried about, not only from barges that might carry missiles, but from Venezuela, who is in bed with Iran, as you know, for longer range missiles. And so we have a soft underbelly, if you will, in this country of no defense there. I'm headed to Mississippi on Monday to Ole Miss to talk to the engineering folk there and the faculty about that problem, and urging them to begin a little rabble-rousing of their need to be defended, because frankly, if we can put Aegis ashore in the middle of Europe, we can certainly put Aegis ashore in Pascagoula, Mississippi, at the naval station there, which has something to do with Aegis, as I recall. I'm not sure what. And this is not a big deal. I mean, nobody is going to be surprised that has looked at this problem about the inherent capability of defending against such missiles in the region. I would argue we ought to do it there. We ought to do it in Florida and the Panhandle and some other places as well. As soon as we rabble-rouse a little bit down there, I hope to talk to Thad Cochran about that.